Thank you. All right. Nearing the end, sort of halfway through the second half. So hopefully there's a little bit of energy left. But first, a couple of questions. So my talk is about the incumbent's dilemma. Who here identifies as an incumbent? No one. Who here identifies as a laggard, somebody that's like falling behind on technology and things like that? No, one person. All right, two. Great. So that'll come into play later. So I'm Thor with Alpha, and what we do is help over a third of the Fortune 100 make decisions, and these people very much identify as laggards, as incumbents, as moving slow, as being awful companies to work for, awful companies to innovate, but they're trying. But in reality, what we've learned is that we see the exact same problems at Fortune 50 companies as well as 50-person startups. So what I'm going to talk about today are some of those lessons. And really what matters when you're figuring out how to serve users better, how to learn faster, how to do all the things that everybody has been talking about on the stage over the last couple of days. So let me start, though, about 10 years ago, a little bit more than 10 years ago, when I've been doing startups for a long time. And back then, a buddy of mine recruited me to help set up a remote studio for a company that I was interested in because they had a poker game on Facebook and had a personal interest in poker. And instead, we built Farmville, Frontierville, all the villes, and sold billions of dollars of virtual farm equipment. No person wakes up in the morning saying, how do I buy more virtual farm equipment? At least not if they're a rational, normal person. But we got 450 million people to do that. And the way we did it is the exact same way that then later I started a healthcare company called Audax Health, later rebranded as Rally Health. And if anybody's in healthcare or patient engagement, probably familiar with it. I ended up selling it to United Healthcare for $2.5 billion. Because all we were trying to do is figure out, how do you drive patient engagement? How do you get somebody to care as much about their health as they did about the virtual farm? And what we learned is that it's really all pretty simple, because what you're doing is you're appealing to people. You're driving behavior change, but really you're trying to give somebody what they want. And the question then became, all right, what's the fastest way for us to learn how to figure it out? If anybody here has tried to build a healthcare product before, you see just like extraordinary red tape, HIPAA compliance, people in large organizations not willing to change, not willing to try things, not willing to do anything, not willing to take a risk because their career depends on it. So how do you then release a product as a startup person into something where it has 3 or 4 year product cycles, where a new product is introduced to market literally every 3 or 4 years, and no sooner because it's risky? So what we had to do is compensate for it by experimenting, but really by driving a whole lot of traffic into fake websites, into landing pages, into like simulated things, into prototypes. And again, a lot of the stuff we were talking about here, a lot of the people that are presenting stuff out there too, just to see what people will click on. Because at the end of the day, data is what we're looking for. We weren't looking to launch a product because we required our clients to do that. But if we had data, we can use that to show them that we know what we're talking about and that we can drive it. And then 5 years ago, started Alpha to really bring that capability to anybody, so that if somebody has a question, it could be just a simple question about why do people not eat their fruits and vegetables, which is literally is a question that one of our clients ran, all the way to like which user onboarding funnel works better and why. Like those are all important questions that today's research methodologies and product management tactics, a lot of the stuff, again, that we've heard about, just doesn't work because it's too slow, it's too expensive, and we have to figure out a way to reduce the barrier to it. But when it comes to product, one of the things that's so great, one of the things that's so fun about being a product manager is that we can all relate to it in some way. It's like everybody here is a consumer as well as a product manager, a product owner, a researcher, designer, developer. So think about a great experience you've had, like really great consumer experience. And just think through that. Take a few seconds and just in your head get a really great picture. And then now think through a really bad experience. like a truly awful, like getting dragged off a United flight kind of experience. And the differences are, the first one is really complex. There's a lot of things that have to go right. Like it's not, generally not, like as a human being, there's not just one thing that makes it really great. It's X, it's Y, it's Z, all of them together, great experience. What does it take for something to go wrong? It's one thing that sticks out. And there isn't really great research on this, but it's something like 10x more in terms of the impact it has on your brain. Like you have to be 10 times better at being good to avoid one bad thing. So we used our platform just for the hell of it to figure out sort of what are the common themes of bad experiences people have. So car dealerships, not surprisingly, commonly bad one. Automotive business in general. So if anybody's in the automotive sector, there's a lot of room for improvement. Same thing with the cable industry. Healthcare, airlines, credit cards, the usual suspects. And that's fine. Like it's easy to understand what that kind of stuff can do. But as product managers, researchers, designers, and developers, trying to put the customer in the center of your experiences, what's important is not just understanding the metrics and the numbers, but the reason why. If you understand why people do something, why they say something, you understand how to change it, how to fix it, how to work with it, how to give them a better experience. And what you'll almost always see are just basic human things. It's not that there's evil people working in car dealerships. Well, maybe. In the cable industry. They're just heavily regulated, and they're incumbents by like the strictest definition of the word. And they're just doing things the same way they've always done them. And it just happens to be that they're not doing it for your benefit, and you suffer as a result. And what you'll almost always see when you're looking at why people have these experiences are things that we all can relate to. Didn't get what they needed because somebody refused it, even if it made sense to get it. Late communication or bad communication. I didn't know what I was getting into. I didn't know what was going to happen next, that kind of stuff. A lot of jargon. Like one of the lessons that we saw that we keep seeing, so almost all the big telecoms are our clients, is they keep trying to sell OTT packages. And still today, and now that I've said it, you'll see ads from AT&T and Verizon and everybody for OTT bundles. And like, maybe people know what OTT is. We can actually tell you how many, and most of them don't. But like everybody knows what streaming video is. But OTT is what it's called internal to them. But then there's the market. Then there's us. And if you don't actually care about what we want, it doesn't matter. You get left behind. Somebody that sells streaming video like Netflix, you'll never see Netflix talk about OTT. And it's no wonder that they're much more successful when it comes to that business. Because what ends up happening is that it's not just a company that's been around for 100 or 200 years. It's not just a company of a certain size. It can be a 10-person startup that had an edge, and all of a sudden they wake up and they realize, shit, this other company is now doing the same thing. So they're now the incumbent. So the point, and nobody raised their hands earlier, but effectively, if you have a product in the market and you have a leadership position of any sort, you are the incumbent. It's yours to lose. Even if you never think of yourself that way, you're disrupting, you're doing things, you're doing interesting things, you're moving fast. But in reality, Snapchat was moving fast before Instagram copied their features 20 different times. And the first 19 failed, but the 20th did not. And the classic examples of Kodak and Blockbuster, obviously MySpace, are fine. But then you look at now public companies like Blue Apron, like the innovation of meal delivery was so easily copied, or meal kit delivery, that there's so many options now, so they don't really have an advantage. And then all the things that got them there are not the things that get them to the next stage. So what you have to do is look at data and be very realistic and very harsh with yourself about the current situation. Like your instinct might be, oh no, we've done this successfully, so we don't need to change anything. We know what we're doing, we know the market, we know best. But in reality, you should always be verifying that. You should always look at the assumptions that are underlying your entire business and try whatever you can to validate it. Even things that are known to be true. Like you'll never buy a house on an iPhone or on a phone. Like that, I'm sure was true 15 years ago. It'd be crazy to buy a house on a phone. It'd be crazy to buy a car on a phone. And today, it's like I could see that. The last thing I want to do is deal with realtors. Like if I can just use my phone, click a button, sure, why not? So it's not just about having the right answers, and it's not just about having empathy, and it's not just about being smart. It's about testing your assumptions as fast as possible. Yesterday, one of the opening sessions, the key message was about the people that learn the fastest will win. And that's exactly right. Even if you're already winning, it's not just about that. It's about your future customer. It's about your future business. It's about what you're going to be doing. And you have to continually refresh what you know. You have to continually validate these assumptions. And you have to look at the things you believe to be true, question what makes you think they're true, run some experiments, even if, again, nobody's asking you to do it. Because if you don't, somebody else does, and they learn something faster than you, and they execute on it faster than you, they may actually do it, especially if you're a small company. Not just faster, but better than you. And if they're a big company, they can literally wipe you out. So if you define the space properly, where your incumbency is determined by your market, again, if you're in any leadership position, like this is a very real thing. Technology now is something that allows, the barriers to entry are so low that allows just about everybody to participate. Like there's a handful of exceptions, but not that many. So if you're talking to somebody and you expect them to be an expert user, somebody will come through and give them an easier service, a better service, something that's less risky, doesn't have any jargon, something they understand. And if you assume and you build an entire 5-year product roadmap on those assumptions, you assume these things are true, nothing will ever change, people will always want to use XYZ method to connect with whoever, like, fine, but if you're wrong on that, you're out of business, which is huge for most companies. And a startup generally only gets to make 1 or 2 bets. A Fortune 500 company has hundreds of bets going at any given time. So they're much more comfortable with being wrong, even though the common folklore, if you will, probably in this room, is that it's startups that are risky and aggressive and pushing for things. In reality, it's the bigger companies. They just have a lot more weight behind it when they move. So it doesn't matter if a startup fails, but you effectively go out of business and lose your company. Like, that's a big problem. So you have a lot more skin in the game. But they don't care. So being able to move fast, being able to learn fast, being able to execute in any way is really the key. And then being able to then understand how the things you're doing, why they tie back to the customer, why they tie back to things that matter, and then how you can iteratively validate that is so important. And one company that probably does it the best, a bit of a cliche at this point, but like Amazon is solely focused as a business on that one thing. Like, does anybody here think they can define the industry that Amazon is in? Just out of curiosity? Because it certainly is not selling books. So if you look at what they actually do, it's very simple. Here's a customer. We're going to serve that customer better than anybody else. And we're going to become a big company on the back end of that, and then deploy our resources to do that better than anybody else. And that's it. And it doesn't matter if it's tech, if it's logistics, if it's services, it truly doesn't matter. And then they just evaluate it based on customer value, iterate, iterate, iterate. And then they see opportunities in the space that are really, really interesting. And really it's around this concept of here it's called divinely discontent, but it really just means that you can always do better. Customers always want more. Like, there will be things that are always true. You will always want something cheaper. You'll always want something faster, no matter what. So if you're building a business around the things that you know will not change, you're good for a while. If you start building a business around things that only exist today because of some external things, you're good until those external things change. And it's really hard to see the difference if you're in the middle of it. If you're managing Jira and your contact with customers is just a spreadsheet, basically, it may be a nice looking spreadsheet, but still, it's really difficult to know what's really going on and when things change. And it's really difficult to look at yourself in the mirror and say, I may not have the right answers. I may be wrong. So by show of hands, just out of curiosity, who here is a product manager? Most people, okay. Designers? Developers? None, okay. So everybody here is telling people what to do, but not necessarily doing it. All right, so that's interesting. Designers do. They do, but not as much as developers, as a developer. And I have the mic, so I can say that. So learning about what customers want is then what I would argue the primary job, where there's product research, product management, and even design. Really being focused on creating solutions that people want. So how do you learn that? How do you remove the barriers? How do you figure it out? And how do you then know, again, when things change? Because when you look at Amazon and what makes them so successful, it's not their design sense. It's not even their software engineering capabilities. It's really just that maniacal focus on the customer, on understanding exactly what they want, how to give it to them now, what they will want, and how to give it to them then. Because what happens generally is that human beings think linearly. They think there's a baseline today, and that baseline is whatever it is. It might have been what we were raised on, it might have been what we're used to today, but in reality, the baseline changes. So future technology is built on future technology. So that if you tried 20 years ago to build an app that first relies on 1 billion people being connected to a platform, well, we first have to connect 1 billion people, which is not that easy. But today, you can literally spend half an hour and launch a Facebook app. So things that were just not even in the realm of possibility 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 2 years ago, are now possible because we have the benefit of platforms today to build on top of. And then in the future, there will be even better platforms. There will be even more scalable platforms. The cost of entry will be even lower. I mean, when I was doing sort of more higher scale computing stuff, building a data center was always a part of the calculation. Like physically building a data center, leasing land, cooling, buying servers, all that stuff. Like today, it's you click a button, put in a credit card into Amazon, and you're done. Like things that would take us millions of dollars and dozens of people to figure out are just not even a concern anymore. Anyone in this room can launch a product in the cloud within minutes. So the question is, what is that going to be tomorrow? Because that's going to be your competition. Your competition is not the platforms and the products that are on the market today, but rather the ones that will be. And the speed, the iteration cycles of those get shorter and shorter and shorter. So that even companies that we look at as leaders in their spaces, social media, for example, and in communication, like if you don't validate these core assumptions, if you operate as if you have all the answers, if you know what customers want better than they do, you'll build these kinds of products. You will build Snapchat spectacles. You'll build Facebook portal. So one more thing, show of hands. Whenever you guys saw Facebook portal for the first time, is anyone here brave enough to think that it was a good idea? Like literally anyone. Like it doesn't take much, but somewhere in a room, they decided, oh no, we need to put a camera in everybody's home because people think we're so good on privacy. Like, and it's great. It's if you have friends that work at Facebook, if you haven't brought this up to them, you should. It's a fun topic. And the Snapchat one's interesting though, but complete failure. But still interesting because they were trying, and they were trying something new, trying to be innovative, but again, they just, as incumbents, it just passed them by. So then what you'll see are these signals, and these signals are now lagging indicators. So how do you know if that's already happened? Well, you start people coming up with excuses. Amazon is not coming up with excuses for their Fire phone, which is a huge flop. They turned that into Alexa. So all the efforts and engineering they put into something that completely failed on paper is now potentially the future of the entire business. Whereas if you rely on assumptions that are false, and you don't iterate, and you don't look at the data, you might wind up going down that path, and it's really, really tough. And then with alpha, what we have is the benefit of being able to validate a lot of this stuff very quickly. So when we see stuff in the news, when somebody claims whatever, like Evan Spiegel did, we actually test it. Of people that go to Instagram, how do they feel afterwards? Of people that go to Snapchat, how do they feel afterwards? And effectively no difference, which is not super surprising, but being able to question reality and match it up with your assumptions and seeing where it's off, and realizing if your assumptions are wrong, you have a big problem, is what I think is going to be table stakes in the future. I think every company is going to have to do that. Because if you don't, you're going to be in a situation where you're operating on borrowed time. And you're going to be building products, you're going to be executing roadmaps, you're going to be designing stuff, you're going to be like doing good work, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because you've already lost before you start. In our world, it's generally with Fortune 500 companies, and it's generally with C-level execs. And I'd say virtually all of them, they get it. Like I sit in executive briefings at least every week where it's a conversation with a C-level exec at a well-known company, and they say something to the effect of, if we don't do this, we're not going to be around in 20 years. And these are household names that all of us know and work with today. And if that's their mindset and they're putting billions of dollars to work against it, there's a lot of interesting things that, again, incumbents that generally speaking, again, is a bad term, have where they can move surprisingly fast. They can work like startups in many ways, and they can actually do the same things. So there's no real magic in it. It's just people. All we're doing is the same thing. It doesn't matter whose name is on our W-2 stubs. Like, we're all trying to figure out how do we better serve users, how do we better build products, and how do we actually compete and win in the end. So out of doing this many, many times now, the four takeaways that we've come up with that are universally useful is really to understand that the customer, the pesky, annoying customer, I don't know, I'm sure all of us have done user tests where you're sitting, or a focus group or something, where you're sitting watching somebody use your product, and you're somewhere, hopefully behind a soundproof piece of glass, screaming at it. The button is right there. Like, turns out you're wrong. The customer's right. I have a great anecdote on that where we had this tutorial. It's a first-time user tutorial of how to use this product, and it was a game, and you had to click on some objects, and one of them was a piece of grass in a field, so it was green on green. And then, of course, nobody noticed it. No user noticed it. It was like, click right there. Nobody saw it. And then a designer came up with an idea, and we discussed it briefly, and we're like, that's a great idea. And we was like, put the biggest, boldest arrow on that piece of grass. This still didn't work. Like, all right, something's going on. Make it bounce. So we had a screen where a significant part of it was this huge arrow bouncing. And then we'd tell people to click on the piece of grass. And they were 20 minutes dragging the map around, clicking on everything other than the piece of grass because, of course, all they saw was the arrow. Like, in the end, it's all very obvious. Like, they didn't even see the thing we're talking about because we're telling them about grass and they see an arrow. So it's cognitive dissonance. If it's like, oh, click on the grass that the arrow is pointing at. Oh, immediately, 100%. Nobody's going to miss it because now they're looking for an arrow. And it's a simple example, but really it applies to entire businesses. Just give people what they want. Understand that the customer is almost always right. If there's a problem, it's not their problem, it's your problem. Because your job is to make it as easy as possible for them to engage, easy as possible to get value, easy as possible to share, use your product, etc. And then how do you do that? You look internally. So you look internally and you figure out what are the barriers from a question to some sort of insight. How long does it take to go from an idea, a question, or whatever, to data, at least directionally showing if it's right or wrong? Because if that's measured in weeks or months, you're effectively dead. Because others can do it in days, and sometimes even hours. And if they can do more in one cycle than you can, if they can do like 10 times more in one cycle than you, what ends up happening is that it has a compounding effect. Because your future experiments are informed by what you've learned. So if you get out of bed in the morning and you have a brilliant idea, all right, you might be right, and it might work, and that's great. But if you get out of bed in the morning with a learner's mindset, that we talked about earlier, like, you will always win. Because you're not relying on luck. You're not relying on the chance that you have the perfect idea. What you're relying on is that you have the right mindset to get there. And you have the right mindset to get there faster, and hopefully you have the right tools. So point number 2 here is really looking internally at your organization. What are the barriers? What are the bottlenecks? What are the tools? What are the resources? And then how do you systematically build that as a capability? How do you figure out how to retool your organization so that it's not just you as a person, it's the whole company? Because everybody has good ideas. We're all human at the end of the day, and everything's very simple. We all just make it too complicated for ourselves. Third point, look at the things that must be true for your product to be successful. I think all of us in this room are in the business of building products one way or another. And there's a lot of stuff that has to line up for good experience, as we went through in the beginning. Like, what are those things that must be true? And if any one of them is not, the whole thing fails. Because the negative stuff stands out so much more than the positive stuff. So what are the assumptions that are critical to the success of your product? How do you identify them? How do you list them? How do you then, most importantly, test them? What are the processes that in step 2 your organization has put together, the tools, the capabilities, etc.? And then going back to the first one, the user is the one that matters. How do you as an individual in that actually figure that out? Now, if you remember getting out of bed in the morning, having all the right ideas is not possible, which means that the plan that you wrote, you spent all night on, even your 2-week sprint plan, or your 5-year product roadmap, pretty much by definition, it's wrong. Like, I don't think I've ever seen a 5-year plan of anything that worked, because there are so many things that go into it. There's so many assumptions. And execution in year 3 depends on year 2. Execution in year 2 depends on year 1, etc. So don't even pretend. Instead, shift to outcomes, shift to objectives, shift to heuristics, shift to like guidelines for how to maybe get somewhere, and then goals to measure against, but not the specific tasks. Like, instead of just actions and activities, focus on like traction and outcomes and things like that, like metrics that matter to the business. And even before you can launch something, like I mentioned with Rally, we couldn't actually launch a product because of the regulation. There's always barriers, there's always hurdles, there's always people telling you no. And if you're at a big company, you have people whose sole job is telling you no. Like, that's it. The IT team is never on your side. The lawyers are never on your side. So how do you actually do that? How do you embrace a culture like that, and how do you figure it out? And the answer to us really is, the first one here is the most important, which is embrace that the customer is who matters, put a stake in the ground around that, and then figure out how to work backwards from what they want. And that's it.
Is your name really Thor?
Yep.
That's what everyone wants to know.
I'm from Iceland, from a little fishing village on the north coast of Iceland. It's called Skagastrand, and everyone there is named Thor.
Everyone is. The whole village.
The whole country.
Oh, the whole country is
Yeah,
named.
it is pretty much the most common name in Iceland. John Johnson is the actual most common name, but Thor as a part of a name is extraordinarily common and perfectly normal. Like, here comes across kind of weird, but in Iceland it's just like a normal name.
All right, we got some great questions in here. We're going to dive right in and get as much out of you as we can in this time. First off, what is the biggest mistake companies make interpreting data? And specifically, I'm skeptical that Facebook really didn't do any validation work. They must have got some signal. I'm really interested how they misinterpreted the signal or just got the wrong signal and how they collected their data.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So first is relying on the wrong conclusions. So you can look at data, and as I think everybody in this room knows, you can draw whatever conclusions you want, and you can shape the data to do so. So it's really about working iteratively, testing often, as much as you can, to validate and revalidate it, because it's not just doing it once. Because I guarantee you, you can ask a question in such a way that people say, yes, they want a camera from Facebook in their house. Yes. And then somebody used that as an executive and said, that's what we're building. We're done with research. We're done with data. We don't need any more. Mm-hmm. So it's not about did they do something or nothing. It's about they didn't do it in the right way, didn't do the right process, which is iterative and customer focused.
Well, that's actually a good lead into this next question then. They say, well, what about Apple?
Yeah.
He says, I feel like they make many decisions based off instinct.
Yeah.
Would you call them an exception?
No.
As an example, they clearly didn't watch someone use the Apple TV remote in a real setting over time. Clearly.
Clearly, I understand and I feel the pain.
Or in the dark.
Or in the dark. I feel the pain. However, Apple is probably the most research-focused company out there.
I agree.
They have entire campuses of fake setups, of fake apartments, of fake homes with fake products that people use for thousands of hours before anything is tested. They test literally every millimeter difference in the curvature of every piece of equipment they make. They are maniacally focused on testing exactly in this way, which is really funny that one of the Steve Jobs quotes is how they don't listen to users, because it is 100% wrong.
Right. And so would you say that an example such as the Apple TV remote is just that they have chosen to ship it anyway? That they
No, I think it works pretty well. I think like for the features that they want, like the things that they were testing for were like what's a combination game controller, TV remote. Like it doesn't look like a remote, and that's what people are uncomfortable with.
Yeah.
It doesn't have buttons that people are comfortable with, but it hit their design objectives.
That's a great point. Next one, what would you suggest is the key mind shift that needs to happen within heavily regulated companies like banks, lending services, healthcare, to be truly disruptive in the consumer experience space?
That's a great question. So, and by the way, we have a lot of content on this, on these kinds of things, these kinds of topics, and happy to share as well, everybody in this room. We have like a free access. So if you have a question, you have just a plain English question about like some experience, some product, some whatever, throw it in the Slack chat and we'll actually test it, run it, show you how this kind of stuff works in real life, and post it back in there, because that's the answer to the question.
Yeah.
So the mindset is letting everybody participate. Like if you look at it as having research is the one that controls the data, everything has to come through them. The executives are the ones that control the strategy. Everything has to come through them. While you have 100,000 consumers of your product sitting there that actually have better ideas. So how do you flip it and make data the currency of how decisions are made as opposed to job title? Like that's the most fundamental thing, but it's obviously very risky. So there are ways to make it safer. So one of the things that we do with Alpha is make it so that everybody in the organization can participate by asking just plain English questions. You're not a researcher, you're not a strategist, you're not even a product manager, you're just a curious human being, and you can now collaborate and participate in the process, and then, in theory, somebody will take your idea, iterate on it, workshop it, and make it into a product. In practice, people just use it for like confirming what they believe to be true.
Sadly, that's actually how much research is done.
Yeah.
The way that it's approached and the way that teams walk away from it is just to confirm. I feel like you've kind of already answered this, but I just want to make sure it gets answered because it received a lot of votes. When you say test all of your assumptions, do you really mean all, or just more than enough to feel strong about a decision?
Yeah.
And if you do mean all, what if you don't have the resources to test all and you need to move quicker than that would allow?
Right, so that's a great question too. I do mean all, but I also recognize that it's not possible. So really it comes down to constraints, shifting the constraints from planning and the stuff that doesn't really matter to focusing on validation, on customers, on really learning. And what that means for this specific question is identifying the things that must be true, at the very least test those. Then there's a bunch of hypotheses. It's a bunch of things that would be nice if they were true because it would make you more successful, but don't really matter. You can get to those later. But if there are just like fundamental things, definitely budget the time or the resources or whatever to figure that out before you invest further, because once you make that investment, once you build, once you do something, you've committed to a path. And changing later is much more expensive and much more difficult than changing before you build it, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, well said. Thank you, Thor.
All right.
Appreciate it.